And we'll begin questions with the Deputy Chair of the Committee, Senator Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly welcome both presenters here today. Very interesting presentations. And in the first presentation from Dr. Beange, I think, how do you pronounce it?
Beange, but that's okay.
Dr. Beange, it generally is approving of the move made in this legislation and saying that it's good legislation, and you gave the following reasons. And then we had Dr. Howe, who said, well, now just hold on a minute. You're taking away certain powers from the Chief Electoral Office, and it will discourage attempts to improve youth voter turnout in the election. So let me ask my first question of Dr. Beange. Are you concerned about anything in the new bill that you addressed overall? For example, you addressed finance regulation and so on. Some people would say that the moves made in the legislation would benefit the rich and the powerful and the big political interests of the day and discourage political participation by other parties. What would you say to that criticism?
I don't think that the evidence bears that out. If you look historically at data as to who contributes to political parties, charities, and so on, it's a relatively small percentage of the population. It always has been. And by no means, I believe in Canada, can it be said that the rich dominate political discourse when the current limit on contributions is as low as it is. By contrast, and I am not saying in any way that we should go in this direction, but if we look at maximum personal political donations in even the UK, they are significantly higher. They are in the thousands of pounds sterling. They're not as low as $1,500. So, or $1,200. So I don't think that that is a major factor. I agree, of course, with Professor Howe that there is youth disengagement, but I am not convinced that it is, quote, the failure or the success of Elections Canada that has brought that about. We see the same trends in youth voter turnout in both the US and UK. In both of those cases, voter education and mobilization is undertaken by political parties and charitable foundations, not-for-profits, and so on. The government does not have an official role at the federal level. So it's difficult to say that we should expand the role of Elections Canada in voter education while at the same time not being able to look at evidence that shows that it's worked in the past. I think there's secular forces that we're all contending with, and so I would sum it up by saying it's not just the government, there has to be room for other actors as well to encourage youth and others.
I would ask Professor Howe to respond to those comments, but I wish to put one further question for the sake of time here that perhaps you both could comment on. You said at the end of your presentation, Dr. Beange, that you said if there are any other subjects that you wish to bring up with the legislation. And I imagine you would have an opinion on the compel argument. As far as, and you're shaking your head, I knew you'd have an opinion on that, as to whether or not this legislation falls short of the mark, because Canadians are all concerned about the robocall matter and the fact that Elections Canada came before this committee and said, look, we're stalled unless a change is made to the Elections Act to allow us to the Commissioner to compel testimony as many other persons in similar positions of authority have the power to do. So I would ask you first, Dr. Beange, to comment on that, and then ask Professor Howe to comment on not only that, but what your previous remarks were.
Okay, first of all, I am not a legal expert, and some of...
You're a PhD on it. So.
I am, but I am not a lawyer.
Yeah, but still. You've spent...
I've spent a lot of time on this, yes. I am of two minds, to be quite honest, on this subject.
Okay.
I understand clearly that Canadians do not want robocalls or anything of the sort. That is a misrepresentation. That is clear. Whether the Chief Electoral Officer himself needs the power to compel evidence, I am not clear that that is the case. Whether the normal recourse of events or processes at the present time are insufficient. I'm not completely sold on that argument.
Professor Howe, on both subjects, sir, if you would.
Sure. On that first question of the political finance regulations, I actually, in my previous presentation to the House of Commons Committee, I had made some comments on that because I had just done a study quite recently with some of my students at UNB, which will be published very soon, on the subject of political finance. Specifically, what we looked at was the degree to which there is some dominance by wealthier Canadians in the system of political finance. So what we did was we looked at some of the records that exist, the public records on individuals who donate more than $200 to a political party. And what we found was that while these people account for 1/4 of all the donors in Canada, their contributions represent about 2/3 of the donation dollars, which is not surprising. But we went further and we also found information regarding the neighborhoods in which these individuals lived, which you can do because you're provided with the postal codes of the donors. And we found that in fact there were about 4 times as many people living in relatively wealthy neighborhoods in the top 20% of household incomes, giving this amount of over $200 as there were people at the bottom end of the scale. So about a 4-to-1 ratio of people at the top 20% versus the bottom 20%. And our conclusion was that in fact there is significant dominance by relatively wealthy Canadians in our current system of political donations. Consequently, raising the limit to $1,500 is not a good move. It's only going to exacerbate that problem. And our conclusion is that the amount should actually be reduced. For example, in Quebec, they've had this debate and they have reduced their maximum donation amount to $100 per year. That's a system that would create a more egalitarian form of political giving rather than the one we have now, which, as I say, is actually quite dominated by wealthier individuals. On the point of concerning other jurisdictions and their promotion of voter participation by young people, as well as the broader reasons for the decline in turnout, I certainly agree that the causes of this phenomenon are, broadly speaking, I would say cultural in nature. They're not a result of anything government has done. I don't even put that much blame on, say, political parties in the way that some might for turning off voters. Nonetheless, this trend has occurred and we do have very low turnout rates. And it's not a problem, I think, that will solve itself. And I don't think we can really look to civil societies to sort of, in a sense, spontaneously take care of this problem. What I do think is that it's a problem that government needs to take the lead on, and in particular, I believe the Independent Elections Agency is the appropriate body to do that. Take the lead in terms of raising the awareness about the issue and encouraging and catalyzing efforts by civil society to try to bring about some positive change. I would also note that in the UK, the Electoral Commission has done a great deal of work in this area, including research and in terms of sponsoring civil society groups to undertake things, much like the Student Vote project that we have here. There's been a similar initiative in the UK. A tremendous amount of work has been done there, and they've taken the issue very seriously.
Professor, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to jump in there. We have a lot of members who would like to ask questions, and I'm going to have to encourage you to try and both witnesses to try and give us all an opportunity to participate. So hope you will reflect upon that with your responses, and we'll move on to Senator Fromm.
Dr. Beange, thank you very much, and both witnesses, thank you very much. 2 excellent presentations. I want to go back to what you said in your presentation. You support the measures of C-23, particularly when it comes to separating the role of the Chief Electoral Officer from the Commissioner. What I took from what you said is that this will give true independence to the Commissioner, who is the investigator, as opposed to what we have now, which you called a muddled reporting scheme. Could you just amplify, because we had even the former Auditor General here saying she thought this such a reporting scheme worked just fine. Can you explain why you think this is an improvement on the reporting scheme?
I think it is an improvement for the following reasons. The first is that the Chief Electoral Officer, and please, this is not a critique of Mr. Mayrand himself, this is simply a commentary on the position of Chief Electoral Officer. The Chief Electoral Officer position has been in place since 1920. And as a result of that, there is huge moral persuasion and moral suasion that adheres to anything at all that the chief electoral officer says. I think to some extent that puts political parties at a disadvantage when it comes to litigation or a contest about what the boundary is for Elections Canada as it pursues violations or alleged violations. For example, again referring to the same hearing, Justice Martineau had to rebuke both Elections Canada and the Conservative Party for what he termed their extreme positions adopted in the case. So I feel that by removing the Commissioner of Canada election and the enforcement of party finance into a different sphere, that will relieve any possible partisan implications or potentially improper influence.
Can I also ask you about the provisions that will increase allowable donations to $1,500? In terms of the world context, what is your opinion about that increase, if it's reasonable?
First of all, if we look again at the two comparable nations, it's not valid to look at, for example, a Zambia or an Indonesia or a South Korea. They don't have the length nor the stability of democracy that we have. That's the first comment I would like to make. The second comment is that $1,500 is a relatively small amount of money, given Canadian incomes. The third thing is that donations do rise with income. If you are on a fixed income, your first thought of giving a donation is not typically to a political party. And a different point is that political donations tend to track charitable donations. So Canadian charitable donations are less, as a percentage of the population, less in absolute dollars than they are in the U.S. Similarly, so are their political donations. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. The final thing is that Quebec may have a $100 limit, but it has had and continues to have severe party financing crises, as witnessed by the ongoing Charbonneau inquiry. So I am not sure that is where we want to look for an example.
Let me ask you also about the issue of the third-party donations.
Yes.
This bill will provide that it's trying to take a measure so that only third parties who have a connection to Canada can contribute. Do you think that is an enforceable measure? First of all, can you comment on the importance of, or not, of keeping out foreign money to influence elections, and is it enforceable?
First of all, let me address the second question first. I think it is enforceable. We currently enforce the fact that foreign nationals cannot give to political parties, for example. So if that's enforceable, it shouldn't be difficult to enforce third-party regulations for foreign donors or activities. And secondly, we've had very strong control on third-party donations for many, many years. I personally think that there is more room for third-party donations and a bigger, stronger actor for third parties because they typically bring to the table new perspectives, new initiatives that perhaps the parties have not taken up on their own. It shouldn't be unlimited by any means, but the current amount, which is roughly $150,000, give or take inflation, is really not very much to reach the number of voters in Canada. The limit within a particular constituency association, again, is minimal when one considers that many constituencies have close to 100,000 voters.